The Varath Empire had fought many wars. They had crushed smaller species under their boots, burned planets that refused to kneel, and swallowed entire systems into their growing territory. They were tall, scaled, cold-blooded in every sense of the word, and they believed, truly believed, that no force in the galaxy was more powerful than them. So when they came to humans for help, it hurt their pride more than any battle wound ever had. The war against the Keth Collective had been going badly for 2 years. The Keth were not like normal enemies. They didn't think like individuals. They moved like a swarm, shared pain like a hive, and rebuilt their losses faster than the Varath could destroy them. Every time the Imperial army thought they had pushed the Keth back, the swarm returned, larger, angrier, and smarter than before. The eastern frontier of the Empire was bleeding. 3 Imperial generals had already been executed for failure. A 4th was currently standing in front of High Marshal Drethak, sweating through his uniform. High Marshal Drethak sat at the head of a long black table aboard his command ship, the Eternal Dominion. He was old, even by Varath standards. His scales were dark green fatting to gray at the edges. His eyes were yellow and sharp, and they had a habit of making every person in the room feel like they were being measured for a coffin. Around him sat his senior officers and advisors, all of them quiet and tense. The general at the end of the table finished his report. The numbers were not good. Casualties were climbing. Supply lines were being cut. The Keth were pushing deeper into Imperial space with every passing month. Drethak was silent for a long moment. Then one of his advisors, a thin Varath named Counselor Veth, leaned forward and cleared his throat. "High Marshal," he said carefully, "there is an option we have not yet discussed." "Say it," Drethak said. "The humans." Veth placed a data chip on the table, specifically a mercenary unit. They call themselves the Ironclad Company, 3,000 soldiers. They have fought in 14 conflicts across the Outer Rim in the last decade. Their record is, he paused, unusual. Drethak picked up the data chip and scanned the information. His eyes moved slowly across the numbers, the battle logs, the casualty figures. Not the Ironclad Company's casualties, but the casualties they had caused. He set the chip down. "They are expensive," he said. "Very," Veth agreed. 40 billion credits upon mission completion. Safe extraction for all survivors, and they insist on controlling their own command structure. No Imperial officer is to give them direct orders. Drethak's lip curled. The idea of paying that much to a band of soft-skinned mammals was almost physically painful, but the Keth Prime offensive needed to succeed. If the eastern frontier collapsed, the political fallout would be worse than any battle. "Fine," he said. "Arrange the meeting." The meeting took place on a neutral station called Corvus Reach, a massive trading post at the edge of Imperial space, where dozens of species pass through every day. It was the kind of place where nobody asked too many questions and everybody watched their back. Colonel Sira Voss arrived with 2 people. Just 2. No guards, no honor escort, no weapons visible. She wore plain gray fatigues with no rank insignia except a small iron clasp on her collar. She was not tall. She was not particularly imposing to look at. She had short brown hair, light brown skin weathered by years in bad weather on worse planets, and gray eyes that seemed to be calculating something every moment they were open. She was 43 years old and had been fighting in some form or another since she was 19. Behind her walked Lieutenant Commander Priya Osai, the regiment's intelligence officer, a sharp, quiet woman who kept a datapad in her hand at all times and noticed everything. Beside Osai was Sergeant Major Dako Mwangi, who was large enough that the Varath honor guards at the door shifted slightly when he walked past them. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Drethak had brought 50 people and wore full ceremonial armor. The contrast was not lost on anyone in the room. They sat across from each other at the table. Drethak began with the standard imperial greeting, a formal speech about the glory of the empire, and the honor being offered to a lesser species by being allowed into Imperial service. Voss waited until he was finished. Then she placed her own datapad on the table and slid it across to him. "The contract," she said simply. Drethak looked at it. His advisors leaned in around him. The terms were already written: 40 billion credits, safe extraction, independent command authority, and a long list of specific clauses. Clause after clause, covering every possible situation, every edge case, every scenario where an employer might try to reduce payment or remove soldiers from a battlefield without agreement. Clause 17, near the bottom, stated clearly, in the event of contract breach by the employer, including failure to pay, failure to extract, or hostile action taken against ironclad company personnel by the employer or their agents, the ironclad company reserves the right to pursue full asset seizure and punitive damages at a rate of 3 times the original contract value. Drethak read it. He had his legal advisors read it. Everyone nodded and smiled and pretended to take it seriously. Then Drethak signed it. He was already thinking about what came after. The humans would go to Keth Prime. They would fight because that's what they did. They would push the Keth back because apparently they were good at that. And then, once the battle was done and the eastern frontier was safe, a small, quiet order would be given. Orbital bombardment of the human positions. Clean. Simple. No witnesses. The 40 billion credits would stay in the Imperial Treasury. The humans would be listed as heroes who died in glorious battle. Problem solved. He handed the datapad back to Voss, with a smile that showed the tips of his teeth. Voss took it, looked at his signature and nodded once. She didn't smile back. Later, aboard the ironclad company's transport ship as it burned toward the edge of Varath space, Osai sat across from Voss in the small briefing room at the back of the ship. The rest of the regiment was in the lower decks, sleeping, cleaning weapons, playing cards, arguing about old football matches from stations back home. "He's going to betray us," Osai said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Voss said. "The contract clause won't stop him. He doesn't think it matters." "He doesn't think we can enforce it," Voss said. "That's different." Osai looked at her. "Can we?" Voss leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Outside, through the narrow viewport, stars moved past in long white lines as the ship accelerated. "The Varath have been fighting the Keth for 2 years," she said. "That means their eastern frontier infrastructure has been operating on war footing for 2 years. Supply depots, fuel relay stations, communication hubs, all of it running at full capacity, probably understaffed because every warm body that can hold a rifle has been sent to the front." She paused. "It's a target-rich environment." Osai was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her datapad and began typing. "I'll start drawing up the secondary plan," she said. "Do that," Voss said. She picked up a battered novel from the table beside her, an old paperback, the kind that people brought across the stars because they couldn't quite let go of certain things, and opened it to a marked page. "And tell Mwangi to start selecting teams. 12 people each, good at quiet work." "How many teams?" Voss thought for a moment. 8, and tell them to pay attention during the campaign. They're going to be doing a lot of scouting that has nothing to do with the Keth. Osai nodded and stood up to leave. At the door she paused. "If this goes wrong," she said, 3,000 people are a long way from home." "It won't go wrong," Voss said, turning a page of her book without looking up. He signed the contract. The moment he did that, he stopped being a high marshal and started being a debtor. The ironclad company arrived at Keth Prime 6 days later. The planet was a nightmare from orbit, brown and gray and scarred, with acid storm systems visible from space like slow yellow bruises moving across the surface. The Varath Orbital Command gave them their landing coordinates and their mission brief. Push the Keth back from the eastern trench lines, relieve the Imperial garrison at Forward Station 9, and hold the Iron Shelf Ridge until Imperial reinforcements arrived. Standard suicidal assignment. The kind of job the Empire gave to people it didn't expect to come back. As the dropships fell through the atmosphere and the planet's surface rose up to meet them, Sergeant Major Mwangi stood at the front of the troop bay and looked at the soldiers packed in tight behind him. Young faces, old faces, men and women from a dozen different nations and stations. All of them human, all of them veterans, all of them watching him. He said nothing ceremonial, nothing inspiring. He just looked at them with his dark, steady eyes and said, "We do the job, we watch each other, we all go home." That was enough. The bay doors opened. The acid wind hit them like a wall. The ironclad company went to work. Behind them, high in orbit aboard the Eternal Dominion, High Marshal Drethak watched their descent on a tactical screen and smiled his cold, reptile smile. He told himself the humans were brave. He told himself they were useful. And he told himself that in 6 weeks, when the battle was done and the Keth were beaten, he would give the order and not feel a single thing about it. He had no idea what was already being planned 3,000 kilometers below him. Nobody ever did with humans. That was the problem. That had always been the problem. You didn't see it coming until the invoice arrived. Keth Prime was not a planet that anyone would choose to fight on if they had a choice. The air was thick with trace acids that ate at unprotected skin and corroded cheap metal over time. The ground was hard-packed gray earth broken up by deep trenches and craters left over from 2 years of artillery exchange. There were no trees, no rivers, no open sky that wasn't streaked with the yellow-brown of incoming storm systems. It was loud all the time, bombardment, counter-bombardment, the distant shrieking of Keth biodrones cutting through the air in swarms. The Varath soldiers already on the ground looked beaten. They moved slowly, spoke quietly, and had the hollow look of people who had been in a bad place for too long and had stopped believing it would ever get better. When the ironclad company's drop ships touched down inside the perimeter of Forward Station 9, the Imperial Garrison Commander, a junior officer named Submarshal Veith, came out to meet them with the exhausted air of a man who had stopped expecting good news. What he got instead was 3,000 humans climbing out of drop ships in full gear, talking loudly, setting up equipment fast, and not looking afraid. Veith stood there for a moment and watched them. One soldier had a speaker clipped to his pack, playing music that Veith's translation chip couldn't identify, something fast and aggressive with heavy percussion. Another group was already spreading out a map on the hood of a vehicle, pointing, arguing, laughing. 2 soldiers near the perimeter wall were arm wrestling, while a third one refereed the match with complete seriousness. "They are," Veith started. "Loud," said one of his aides. "I was going to say unconcerned," Veith said. Colonel Voss appeared from the middle of the organized chaos and walked up to Veith. She shook his hand, a human gesture that Varath rarely used, but Veith had been briefed on and asked for a full tactical update. Veith gave it to her in 15 minutes. She listened without interrupting, asked 4 sharp questions, thanked him, and went back to her people. Within 2 hours, the ironclad company had fully integrated into the station's defense positions. Within 4 hours, they had already started pushing out beyond the perimeter, scouting, testing the Keth lines, probing for weak points. Veith watched them go with something he couldn't quite name. He sent a short message to Varath Imperial Command that night. "Human mercenaries have arrived. Initial assessment. Aggressive, disciplined, unusual behavioral patterns. Morale impact on garrison. Significant and positive." He never sent a follow-up report about the humans being afraid, because they never were. The first major action came on the 3rd day. The Keth hit the southern trench line just before dawn, which was a common tactic. The acid storm cycles made sensor sweeps unreliable in the pre-dawn window, and the Keth had learned to exploit it. They came in waves, thousands of the biomechanical creatures moving across open ground in patterns that looked almost random but weren't. They communicated through signals too fast for individual brains to process. the whole swarm reacting as one thing to whatever the other parts experienced. The Vareth troops in the southern trenches fell back almost immediately, not because they were cowards. They were tired, overwhelmed, and had seen this kind of assault fail before. Falling back was the trained response. The ironclad company did not fall back. Sergeant Major Dako Mwangi was in the southern trenches when the wave hit. He had 2 full squads with him, 24 people. The Varath soldiers around him were already beginning to pull out, and for a moment the trench was a mess of movement going in different directions. Mwangi's voice cut through the noise like a physical thing. Hold the line. Bravo and Charlie squads left and right of the junction. Set heavy weapons here, here, and here. Move. They moved. It was not complicated and it was not pretty, but it was fast and it was disciplined. The heavy weapons went up. The fields of fire were set, and when the Keth wave hit the junction, it hit a wall. The fight lasted 4 hours. At one point, a section of the trench wall collapsed under artillery fire, and 3 of Mwangi's people were buried up to their waists. The other soldiers dug them out with their hands while still returning fire. One of them came out of the dirt, cleared his rifle in 10 seconds, and went right back to shooting. A Vareth soldier crouched nearby watched this happen with his mouth open. When the Keth finally pulled back, not retreating, just regrouping, as they always did, the junction was still held. 24 humans had stopped an assault wave that had pushed 3 times their number of Vareth troops back in the first few minutes. Mwangi sat down in the dirt with his back against the trench wall, pulled out a battered metal flask, drank from it, and offered it to the nearest Vareth soldier. The soldier stared at him. Mwangi shrugged and put it away. "Get some water," he said. "They'll come back in a few hours." They did come back. Mwangi held the line again. Over the next 3 weeks, the ironclad company ground the Keth down. The aliens watching from the Vareth Orbital Command got used to seeing their tactical screens show human positions advancing when every model said they should be retreating. They watched humans fight at night without thermal band visors and still hit their targets. They watched humans take casualties, real casualties, people who were hurt and people who died, and keep going. Not because they felt nothing, but because stopping was not something they were willing to do. The behavior confused the Vareth observers. There were long discussions aboard the Eternal Dominion about what drove the humans to push like this. Some thought it was chemical, some biological aggression response. Others thought it was simple programming, some military conditioning. One younger officer suggested, quietly, that maybe it was personal, that humans fought hard because they actually cared about the people beside them. The older officers dismissed this. But the young officer wasn't wrong. The ironclad company had been together for a long time. They had fought on ice planets and desert moons and flooded colony worlds. They had lost people and buried them and kept going. They trained together, ate together, argued and laughed, and occasionally fought each other in ways that somehow made them closer instead of further apart. They were not a military unit in the formal sense. They were something older than that, something that didn't have a good word in most languages. They were, for lack of a better word, a family. A very large, very armed, extremely dangerous family. And you did not betray families without consequences. On the 19th day, Lieutenant Commander Priya Ose found what she had been looking for. She had been monitoring Imperial communication frequencies during every quiet moment of the campaign, intercepting fragments, running them through her decryption algorithms, building a picture from pieces. On the 19th night, sitting in a dugout command post with a cold cup of something that was supposed to be coffee and wasn't, she finally had enough pieces to see the whole image. The transmission was between 2 Imperial officers on the Eternal Dominion. It was encrypted with Vareth military-grade protocols, which were good but not designed with humans in mind. Ose had spent 2 years studying Vareth encryption patterns. She had also, in a past life before mercenary work. worked signals intelligence for 3 different colonial defense forces. She broke the encryption in about 40 minutes. The message was short. It confirmed that once the ironclad company completed the push and secured the Iron Shelf Ridge, the final objective of the campaign, an orbital strike order would be issued. Human positions only, timed for maximum coverage. The garrison at Forward Station 9 would be informed in advance to evacuate. The humans would not be warned. The reasoning given was purely financial. 40 billion credits was a significant expense. The Empire had no ongoing need for human mercenaries after the Eastern Campaign. Dead soldiers didn't file complaints. Osai read it twice. Then she closed the file and sat quietly for a moment in the dark dugout, listening to the distant sound of artillery. She went to find Voss. Voss read the decrypted message standing outside in the dark, the acid-tinged wind pressing against her face. When she finished, she handed the datapad back to Os and looked out over the scarred ground toward the distant glow of the Iron Shelf Ridge. "How long before we complete the objective?" she asked. "At current pace, 6 days, maybe 5. "And the orbital strike window?" "Based on the transmission timing and the ship positioning data, they'll want to act within 12 hours of us reaching the ridge, before they file the official mission completion report. Cleaner that way." Voss nodded slowly. Around them, the camp was quiet with the specific quiet of soldiers sleeping between shifts, generators humming, the occasional cough, someone laughing softly 2 tents over. 3,000 people who had followed her into a nightmare planet and done everything asked of them. "Mwanga's teams," she said. 8 teams, 12 people each, ready. They've been collecting information during the campaign, patrol routes, installation access codes, supply depot locations, Station 9's communication protocols, Vareth frigate docking procedures. Osa paused. "Voss, we have 3 frigates in orbit doing resupply runs on a 6-day rotation, if we time the teams right." "I know," Voss said. "Brief the team leaders tonight. Full secondary plan activates the moment we secure the ridge." She paused. "And tell them to be quiet about it. The last thing we need is for someone to do something obvious and tip them off." Osai started to leave. "Priya," Voss said. Osai looked back. "Good work," Voss said simply. Osai nodded and walked back toward the command post. Voss remained outside a moment longer, looking up through the yellow haze of the atmosphere at the dark sky above. Somewhere up there was a ship full of people who had already decided her soldiers' lives were worth nothing. She filed that thought away in a cold, quiet part of her mind, turned around and went back to planning. She had a ridge to secure first. Everything else would come after. The Keth didn't know what was coming. The Empire didn't know what was coming. Even her own soldiers only knew in pieces. But the plan was already in motion. It had been in motion, in one form or another, since the moment Drethak signed that contract with his cold, yellow eyes and his quiet certainty that humans were just tools. Tools didn't plan ahead. Humans always did. The Battle of the Iron Shelf lasted 2 days. The Iron Shelf was a long ridge of hard gray rock running east to west across the northern edge of the Keth's main forward territory. It was high ground, the kind of high ground that changed the whole shape of a war. Whoever held it could see everything below. Whoever held it could call fire down on anything that moved. The Keth knew this. The Empire knew this. And so the Keth had dug into it like they had always intended to die there. They almost got what they wanted. The ironclad company hit the ridge from 3 directions at once, moving in the pre-dawn window that the Keth usually used for their own attacks. It was a calculated reversal. The Keth swarm's biggest strength was also its biggest weakness. It reacted collectively, which meant that when something unexpected happened at multiple points simultaneously, the collective decision-making slowed down for just a moment while the hive tried to process conflicting inputs. Voss had been watching that pattern for nearly a month. That hesitation, was all the humans needed. Mwangi led the central push personally. His boots had been on this planet for 25 days, and he was tired in a way that went past muscles and into something deeper. But his hands were steady and his voice was steady, and the soldiers behind him matched him step for step. They went up the rocky face of the shelf under fire, using the craters and the broken ground as cover, and they didn't stop. 2 soldiers in Mwangi's squad were hit in the first hour. The rest of the squad pulled them to cover and kept moving. That was the human way of it. You didn't abandon people, but you also didn't stop, because stopping meant everyone died instead of just some people. It was a hard math that every soldier learned eventually. The ironclad company had learned it a long time ago. By noon on the second day, the ridge was taken. The Keth pulled back from the shelf, regrouping into their underground network further north. Their biomechanical drones swept across the sky one last time and then disappeared. The ridge was quiet for the first time probably in 2 years. Mwangi stood at the top of the shelf and looked out over the gray, broken landscape below. The acid wind was lighter up here. He could see for a long way. Behind him, his soldiers were checking each other for wounds, setting up defensive positions, calling out names and getting answers. He counted the answers in his head without moving his lips. When all of them came back, something in his chest loosened very slightly. He reached into his jacket and took out the battered metal flask and allowed himself one long drink. Then he put it away, turned around, and started giving orders. The mission was complete. Now came the other part. The 8 teams had already been moving for 18 hours before the ridge was secured. They had slipped out of the ironclad company's perimeter in small groups over the previous 2 days, using the chaos of the ongoing campaign as cover. Each team leader had a sealed set of orders from Voss and Osai, target assignments, access codes collected during the campaign, specific objectives that had nothing to do with the Keth, and everything to do with the infrastructure of the Vareth eastern frontier. Team 4 made their way to the Imperial Fuel Relay Station at Gorath Point, a small automated installation about 200 kilometers from the front lines. The 6-person crew managing it had grown comfortable over 2 years of war. The front was far away. The Keth never reached this deep, and the daily routine was boring enough that security protocols had grown relaxed. Team 4 spent 40 minutes bypassing the external sensors, another 20 minutes inside, and left without anyone aboard the station knowing they had ever been there. They left behind a set of devices that would activate on a specific encrypted signal. Team 7 was more ambitious. They had spent the last 2 weeks working in rotating shifts during quiet periods, studying the docking and access protocols of the 3 Vareth frigates that handled resupply runs to the Eastern Front. The frigates rotated on a 6-day schedule, which meant there was always at least one in the orbital zone near Keth Prime at any given time. Imperial crews were stretched thin. The frigates ran with minimal staff during resupply cycles. Team 7, 12 people who had collectively operated in 6 different space environments over the years, knew how to move through a ship without being noticed. Over a period of 4 days, using docking access codes that OSA had extracted from intercepted traffic management signals, members of Team 7 had quietly placed themselves aboard all 3 frigates, embedded in cargo manifests, hiding among contracted logistics workers, accessing maintenance corridors during crew rotation windows. By the time the Iron Shelf was secured, Team 7 had effective control of all 3 ships without firing a single shot. The other teams were similarly busy. Communication relays, supply depots, the Navigation Management Center for the 9th Imperial Fleet's resupply chain, each one quietly and carefully accessed, documented, and set up for the next phase. OSI coordinated all of it from a portable command setup in a dugout at the base of the Iron Shelf. She had not slept properly in 3 days and was operating on caffeine and the specific kind of focused calm that came from having so many things to track that there was simply no space left in her brain for anxiety. When Voss's confirmation signal came in, "The ridge is secured," Os let out a long, slow breath, cracked her knuckles, and began sending the activation messages. Aboard the Eternal Dominion, High Marshal Drethek received the battle report at 900 hours ship time. The Iron Shelf had been taken, the Eastern Keth advance was broken, Forward Station 9 was secure, the campaign was functionally over. He read the report twice, not because it was unclear, but because he wanted to enjoy it for a moment. 2 years of grinding failure, 2 generals executed, billions of credits spent on a war that had seemed unwinnable, and now it was over because a band of 3,000 humans had gone to a terrible planet and done what his own armies could not. He found this mildly annoying and also completely irrelevant. He set the report down and looked at his senior officer, Fleet Commander Wrath, who stood at attention on the other side of the table. "The human positions," Drethek said. "Confirmed, High Marshal. They are consolidated on and around the Iron Shelf Ridge. 47 capital cannons have firing solutions. All positions are within strike range. And the garrison at Station 9. Evacuation order transmitted 40 minutes ago. They will be clear of the blast radius within the hour." Drethek nodded. He poured himself a small glass of fermented spice wine, a private reserve he kept for significant moments, and held it for a moment without drinking. "Make sure the mission report lists them as heroes," he said. "Killed in a final Keth counterassault while holding the ridge, something appropriate, something that sounds like what they would have wanted." "Of course, High Marshal." "And begin processing the budget reallocation for the saved contract payment." "Already initiated, High Marshal." Drethek drank his wine. It was very good wine. "Fire when ready," he said. 47 cannons fired. The Iron Shelf lit up on the tactical screens in a cascade of impact markers. Rock and dirt and metal vaporized under the bombardment. The strike lasted 11 minutes and was, by any technical measure, a very effective piece of orbital artillery work. When it was over, the area where the ironclad company's consolidated positions had been was a series of perfectly spaced craters. Nothing moved. Nothing could have survived. The bridge of the Eternal Dominion was quiet for a moment. Then Drethek set down his empty glass and the tension in the room broke. Officers exchanged looks of satisfaction. Someone at a rear console started processing the budget paperwork. Drethek stood up, clasped his hands behind his back, and walked toward the door. He had exactly 11 minutes of satisfaction. Then every alarm on the ship went off at once. The first report came in from the fuel relay station at Gorath Point: total power failure, systems unresponsive, output at 0. Then the Navigation Management Center for the 9th Fleet's resupply chain went offline. Then the communication hub at Vareth Relay Station 9, the single most important signal routing point in the entire eastern frontier, simply stopped transmitting. Then Fleet Commander Wrath's voice came over the internal comm, tighter than Drethek had ever heard it. "High Marshal, we have a situation with the resupply frigates." "What situation?" A pause. "They are not responding to Imperial command codes. They are, High Marshal, they are responding to different command codes. We don't recognize the authorization signature." Drethek turned back from the door very slowly. "What authorization signature?" Another pause. When Wrath spoke again, his voice had the quality of a person reading something they couldn't quite believe. "It says Ironclad Company, authorization Voss S. Colonel." The room was very quiet. Then every Imperial frequency in the eastern sector crackled, and a voice came through, calm, clear, unhurried. A human voice. A woman's voice. The kind of voice that sounded like it had already thought through everything you were about to say before you said it. "High Marshal Drethek, this is Colonel Sira Voss of the Ironclad Company. I'm calling to inform you that you are currently in violation of our contract, specifically clauses 4, 9, 12, and 17. In accordance with clause 17, we are now exercising our right to pursue damages. A brief pause. You'll be receiving an invoice shortly. We recommend you review it carefully. Then the frequency went quiet. Drethak stood in the center of his bridge, surrounded by flashing alarms and the panicked voices of his officers. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt something he did not know how to process. He had signed a contract with humans. He had tried to kill them. They had survived. And now they were collecting. His counselor Veth appeared at his elbow, and the old thin advisor had the look of a person who had warned someone about something important and had not been listened to. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The alarm said everything for him. The Vareth Empire was very large, very old, and very powerful. It had hundreds of warships, millions of soldiers, hundreds of years of military doctrine written down in thick books and taught in strict academies. It had fought wars on a dozen fronts and won most of them. It had more resources, more firepower, and more territory than the Ironclad Company, by every measurement that any military planner would put on a chart. None of that helped, because the Ironclad Company was not fighting the Vareth Empire the way the Vareth Empire knew how to be fought. Every military doctrine in the Imperial Library assumed that an enemy would try to engage on equal terms, ships against ships, soldiers against soldiers, firepower against firepower. Every Imperial general was trained to think about force ratios, about front lines, about supply chains and logistics. They were trained for conventional war. What Voss ran was not a conventional war. It was an education. The 3 captured Vareth frigates were the beginning. Team 7, 12 people who had spent weeks quietly learning Vareth ship systems from the inside, now ran those ships with the kind of confident competence that came from people who had operated in space environments for most of their adult lives. The frigates were not weapons of war in the direct sense. They were tools of access. With valid Vareth IFF codes and legitimate-looking command signatures, they could dock at almost any Imperial installation in the eastern sector without triggering immediate alarms. They used this very carefully. The Vareth shipyard at Gorath Station was the Empire's primary repair and construction facility for the Eastern Fleet. It was staffed by thousands of workers and protected by a ring of automated defense platforms. Getting inside with weapons would have been impossible. Getting inside as a routine resupply frigate was trivially easy. 2 people from Team 3 spent 4 hours aboard the station during a maintenance window, moving through service corridors that weren't on the main maps because they were old and nobody had updated the schematics in decades. When they left, they had not fired a single shot. They had not damaged a single wall. They had simply accessed the central control systems for every dry dock crane in the facility and pushed through a firmware update. 3 days later, every crane in the shipyard stopped moving, not in a dramatic explosion, not with fire or wreckage. They simply locked up. A small error message appeared on each control terminal. The message was in a code format that didn't match any Vareth diagnostic system, and the technical staff spent 4 days trying to figure out how to override it. The override code was available. It was listed at the bottom of the error message in very small text. Above it, in equally small text, was a price. The Vareth engineers were not authorized to pay it, so they escalated to command. Command escalated to the budget office. The budget office escalated to the Imperial High Council on Vareth Prime. The shipyard sat idle for 2 weeks while the bureaucracy tried to figure out who was responsible for this situation, and more importantly, who was going to pay for it. 11 warships that should have completed repairs in that window did not complete repairs. The Eastern Fleet's operational capacity dropped by a measurable percentage, and the report that landed on Drethak's desk made his eye twitch. The fuel situation was more immediate. The relay station at Gorath Point had been the main fuel routing hub for the 9th Imperial Fleet's resupply operations. When the devices that Team 4 had placed came online, they didn't destroy the fuel that would have been wasteful, and the ironclad company was running a business, not a bombing campaign. Instead, they rerouted the output. Over the course of 5 days, approximately 11 billion credits worth of refined fuel quietly left the Imperial supply chain and arrived at 3 different neutral trading stations along the outer rim. Each shipment came with a legitimate bill of sale and an automated transfer document. The buyers, a Keth-adjacent species called the Dolrani who had been desperately looking for fuel supplies due to their own ongoing conflicts, paid market rate. The ironclad company account that received the payment was registered on a neutral station under a corporate name that took Varath intelligence analysts 3 weeks to trace back to its source. Fleet Commander Wrath presented the fuel loss report to Drethak on the same morning that the shipyard crane report arrived. He placed them both on the table and stood back and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Drethak looked at both reports, then he looked at Wrath, then he looked back at the reports. "Where are they?" he asked. "Where are the humans physically located?" "That's the—" Wrath stopped and chose his words carefully. "That's the difficulty, High Marshal. We don't have reliable information on their physical location. We have evidence of their activity in at least 7 different locations across the eastern sector, but they don't appear to be consolidated anywhere. Our intercepts suggest small teams operating independently." "Send a fleet to intercept the frigates." "We have. The frigates changed their IFF codes and docked at a neutral-flagged station before our ships arrived. We can't engage them there without creating an incident with 3 other species who also use that station." Drethak was quiet. "Intercept their communications," he said. "We're trying. They're using encryption formats we haven't seen before. They also appear to be deliberately communicating in fragments, pieces spread across multiple frequencies that don't look meaningful individually. Our signal analysts are working on it." What Wrath didn't know, what the Varath analysts sweating over their equipment didn't know, was that some of the ironclad company's communications were in old Earth languages. Not the standardized human trade language, but old national languages, Swahili, Portuguese, Yoruba, Punjabi, spoken by soldiers who had grown up with them, and kept them the way humans kept all kinds of old things, because letting them go felt wrong. No Varath translation algorithm had more than 30% coverage on pre-contact Earth languages. The fragments that got through were noise. Mwangi had suggested it in a briefing 3 weeks before the Ridge assault. Voss had written it into the communication protocol the same day. On the 14th day after the orbital strike, something happened that Drethak had not anticipated. The political situation on Varath Prime fell apart. Os had been sitting on a specific piece of data for a while, waiting for the right moment. During the campaign, her signals intelligence work had intercepted more than just the betrayal order. She had also collected 6 months of internal Imperial communications that documented, in considerable detail, the financial arrangements that Drethak and his noble house had made with the private contractors supplying the Eastern Front campaign. The contracts were inflated. The actual costs were about 40% of what had been charged to the Imperial Treasury. The difference, billions of credits, had moved through a series of shell accounts into investments controlled by the Drethak family holdings. It was, plainly and simply, war profiteering. It was also deeply illegal under the Imperial Legal Code, a fact that made it significantly more interesting. Os transmitted the complete file, all of it, organized clearly, with a full summary at the front written in standard Varath script, simultaneously to every major news outlet serving Varath Prime, to all 12 members of the Imperial High Council, and to the Galactic Council's Ethics Oversight Office. She sent it in the middle of the Vareth political day, timed for maximum impact. The explosion was not physical, but it was very real. The High Council convened an emergency session within 6 hours. The news feeds on Vareth Prime ran the story on permanent rotation. 3 of Drethak's noble house allies released immediate statements distancing themselves. The Imperial Treasury launched an audit investigation. The Military Affairs Committee called for a review of all Eastern Front procurement decisions. Drethak received all of this in rapid succession over the course of a single afternoon, each report landing on his desk like a physical blow. He had sent his communications staff home by early evening because he couldn't stand to look at any of them. He sat in his command suite aboard the Eternal Dominion, alone, and stared at the wall. Outside, across the eastern frontier, his fleet was chasing ghosts. His shipyard was locked up. His fuel reserves were gone. His political career was on fire. And somewhere out in the dark, 3,000 humans in 3 captured frigates and a dozen safe houses were still moving, still working, still sending small iron plaques, the calling card, to every installation they had touched. The plaques said in neat standard script, "Invoice pending." His counselor Veth had told him, at the very beginning, that humans had a concept called a grudge. Drethak had dismissed this as a small cultural quirk. He was reconsidering that now. On the 16th day, Drethak sent a message to Colonel Voss through a neutral broker, a Dolrani trader who regularly worked the Outer Rim stations and had a reputation for discretion. The message was short. It asked for a meeting on neutral ground. He did not use the word negotiate. The word he used translated roughly as discuss terms. The broker transmitted the message to a drop point on Corvus Reach. The reply came back after 3 days. Just 3 days, not because Voss hadn't received it sooner, but because she had decided 3 days was the appropriate amount of time to make him wait. The reply confirmed the meeting. Location: Corvus Reach, the neutral trading station. Date: 8 days from transmission. Format: open session. Diplomatic observers welcome. The last part was Osai's idea. Voss had approved it immediately. If the Empire was going to pay what it owed, and it was going to pay, then the whole galaxy should be present to watch. Not out of cruelty, not out of revenge, but because reputation was a real and useful thing, and there were other species out there who employed human mercenaries, and other mercenary companies made up of other species who watched what happened when contracts were honored or broken. The universe needed to understand what it meant to double-cross the ironclad company. On the day the meeting was announced, Mwangi was sitting in the small mess area of one of the captured frigates, eating a meal he had warmed in a military pack heater when the news came through. He read the confirmed meeting date on his datapad and nodded to himself. Around him, soldiers who had heard the news were talking quietly, some of them smiling. He thought about Keth Prime. He thought about the ridge. He thought about the drop ships going down through the yellow atmosphere on the first day, and the soldiers behind him, and the words he had said. "We do the job, we watch each other, we all go home." 3,000 in. 3,000 out. Not one of them had died on that ridge from the orbital strike, because not one of them had been on that ridge when the strike hit. They had been 100 different places by then, doing 100 different things, because their colonel had planned for the worst before the contract was ever signed. Mwangi finished his meal, washed his utensils, and began writing a short message to his sister back on Nairobi Station. He wrote to her after every job when the active phase was over. It was a habit he had kept for 20 years. He told her the job was done. He told her they were all coming home. He told her the pay was going to be very good this time. He didn't go into the details. She always said she didn't want the details. He sealed the message and sent it, then went to find the officers briefing on the meeting at Corvus Reach. There was still one more thing to do. The invoice still needed to be delivered. Corvus Reach was the kind of station that existed at the edges of things, not quite inside anyone's territory, not quite outside everyone's interest. It sat at the junction of four major trade routes and had been built up over 2 centuries by successive generations of owners who kept adding sections whenever they needed more space, which was always. The result was a massive, chaotic, beautiful mess of corridors and docking bays and market levels and meeting halls, all bolted together in a way that made no architectural sense, but somehow worked perfectly. On a normal day, Corvus Reach processed about 40,000 visitors from 30 different species. It was loud and busy and smelled like 6 different kinds of food at once, and most people who spent more than a day there decided they either loved it or they wanted to leave immediately. The day of the meeting was not a normal day. Every docking bay had been full for 36 hours. Ships had come from across the outer rim and beyond, traders, journalists, diplomatic couriers, private observers, and a significant number of people who were simply curious. News of the meeting had spread fast, the way news always spread fast when something genuinely unusual was happening. The galaxy had a lot of political meetings, a lot of negotiations, a lot of formal ceremonies where powerful people sat across from each other and traded careful words. It did not often have a situation where a mercenary company of 3,000 humans had run a 2-week economic and intelligence campaign against a star empire, and then called the empire's leader to a neutral station to pay the bill. This, people felt, was worth showing up for. The main meeting hall on Corvus Reach, a circular room with a high domed ceiling and tiered observation galleries running around the upper half, had been booked for the occasion. Normally it was used for multi-species trade arbitration. Today it had been rearranged. A single long table in the center, 2 chairs on each side, and 300 seats in the observation galleries for diplomatic witnesses from 14 species who had formally requested observer status. The hall was full when Drethak arrived. He had brought 50 people in his official delegation and wore full imperial ceremonial dress, dark armor with gold trim, the rank markings of a high marshal running down both arms, the formal headpiece that indicated his status in the noble hierarchy. It was an impressive display. It was the kind of display that was supposed to make other people feel small and impressed and aware of the power they were dealing with. The observers in the galleries watched him walk in. Then the side door at the other end of the table opened, and Colonel Sira Voss walked in with 2 people behind her. Plain gray fatigues, the small iron clasp on her collar, no ceremony, no honor guard. She walked to her side of the table, put a datapad down, and sat. Behind her, Osa and Mwangi took their seats without any particular expression. Mwangi had cleaned up, his uniform was neat, his boots were polished, but he had also clearly not slept much in recent weeks, and neither had any of them. They looked like people who had been working hard for a long time and had one more task left to complete before they could rest. Drethak sat down across from Voss. His 50-person delegation arranged themselves behind him. He looked at Voss across the table, this small, plain, quiet human woman who had cost him more in 3 weeks than most wars cost in a year, and he said, very carefully, "Colonel, I appreciate you agreeing to this meeting." Voss looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the datapad from the table in front of her and slid it smoothly across the table to him. "The invoice," she said. Drethak looked at the datapad. His legal advisor leaned in from the right. His financial officer leaned in from the left. The 3 of them looked at the screen together, and the room was quiet enough that the slight sound of Drethak's slow, controlled exhale could be heard in the first few rows of the gallery. The invoice was detailed. It was very, very detailed. The original contract fee was listed at the top, 40 billion Vareth credits. Beside it in clear text was a note, completed in full. Eastern Keth advance broken. Iron Shelf Ridge secured. Forward Station 9 relieved. All contractual objectives met. Below that, under the heading Contract Breach Penalties, Clause 17, the math was laid out step by step. Breach of contract by the employer. Hostile action taken against ironclad company personnel. Orbital bombardment of known human positions. The multiplier, 3 times the original contract value, 120 billion credits. Below that was a detailed line-item breakdown of additional charges. Hazard compensation for the orbital strike attempt, calculated using a specific human legal formula that took into account the number of personnel targeted, the nature of the threat, and a precedent from a previous contract dispute that the ironclad company's lawyers had evidently filed and won some years earlier. 40 billion credits. Asset recovery costs, fuel, ships, communication access, installation time. 17 billion credits with supporting receipts. The receipts were attached, all of them, in order. Then, near the bottom of the document, a line that had no legal precedent in any galactic treaty Drethak's advisors were aware of, but which had been written with full legal notation, clear definitions and footnotes. Emotional distress and reputational risk surcharge. 3 billion credits. The footnote attached to this item was 4 paragraphs long and referenced something called the Revised Human Mercenary Guild Standards of 2381, which was apparently a real document, and which Drethak's legal advisor was already looking visibly sick about. Total due, 180 billion Varath credits. Payable within 30 days. At the very bottom, in small text, was a final note. The ironclad company will retain possession of 3 Varath Imperial frigates, registry numbers 7 Wrath, 9 Wrath, and 12 Wrath, as a late payment processing fee. Vessel documentation will be transferred to neutral registry upon receipt of full payment. Drethak set the datapad down. The room remained very quiet. Then one of the Dolrani observers in the gallery coughed softly, and the sound was very loud in the silence. Drethak looked across the table at Voss. He had prepared for this meeting. He had brought his best lawyers and his best negotiators, and had spent the flight here preparing arguments about legality, about jurisdiction, about the limitations of mercenary contract enforcement in interstellar law. He had prepared a counteroffer. He had prepared a schedule of smaller payments. He had prepared, in the back of his mind, a quiet discussion about whether any of this was actually enforceable at all. Voss let him start. She sat with her hands flat on the table, and she listened to the opening arguments from his legal team. 6 minutes of technical language about jurisdictional frameworks and treaty limitations, and the historically ambiguous status of Clause 17 under galactic commercial law. When they were done, she turned to Osai and nodded once. Osai opened her own datapad and placed it in the center of the table. That's the complete financial audit of House Drethak's Eastern Front procurement contracts for the last 3 years, Osai said, calmly and clearly. It documents, in detail, approximately 34 billion credits in inflated billing to the Imperial Treasury. There are also communications attached that connect these transactions directly to the High Marshal's personal financial holdings. She paused. We have already transmitted a preliminary version to the High Council and to the Galactic Ethics Oversight Office. The complete version is prepared for full public release. She looked at Drethak the way a person looks at something they've already measured and categorized and moved past. It is not part of the invoice, she continued. It is simply context for the conversation. The 6 members of Drethak's legal team were no longer discussing jurisdictional frameworks. They were very quiet and very still. Drethak's financial officer, a small, thin Varath who had been keeping his expression neutral through the whole meeting, leaned forward and whispered something in Drethak's ear. Drethak closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his expression had changed. The ceremony was gone. The performance of imperial dignity was gone. What was left was just an old, tired politician looking at the end of something. The frigates, he said. We keep them, Voss said. That's not negotiable. A pause. The payment schedule, he said. 30 days full amount. Drethak was quiet for a long moment. Around him, behind him, the 50-person delegation was also quiet. In the observation galleries, 300 witnesses from 14 species were watching without a sound. Outside in the corridors, journalists from a dozen different news outlets were waiting for whatever came out of this room. Very well, Drethak said. 2 words, flat and final. Voss nodded once, picked up the datapad from the table and made a small note on it. Done. The payment cleared on the 28th day, 2 days before the deadline. 180 billion Vareth credits, transferred in full to the ironclad company's account on Corvus Reach. Osai confirmed receipt, checked the amount 3 times, and then turned to Voss and simply nodded. Voss was standing at the viewport of their rented suite on the station, looking out at the docking bays below where their 3 frigates sat in their berths. She watched a cargo loader move slowly past, and then looked at her own reflection in the viewport glass for a moment, tired face, gray eyes, the small iron clasp on her collar that she had worn so long she stopped noticing it. Transfer 1 million to the families of the 6 who didn't make it home from previous campaigns, as planned, she said quietly. Then standard pay distribution across all 3,000 personnel, officers' bonuses according to the scale. Already queued, Osai said. Mwang is asking about departure timing. Tomorrow morning, let people sleep first. Osai went back to her datapad. From somewhere down the corridor, the sound of music drifted through. Someone had a speaker going, something fast and percussive that Voss had heard in drop ships and dugouts in the back of transports for 20 years. Soldiers off duty, soldiers paid, soldiers going home. She stayed at the viewport a little longer. The news cycle about the meeting had already gone wide across the galactic networks. 3 different species editorial outlets had called it a historic moment in commercial contract enforcement. The Galactic Mercenary Guild had sent a formal message of congratulations. 2 sovereign states had quietly begun drafting legislation. 2 other mercenary companies had sent messages of professional respect, one of them quite lengthy and enthusiastic. And in the military academies of 14 species, in the offices of treaty lawyers across the rim, in the briefing rooms of private security firms and corporate defense contractors and small independent units operating in frontier space, the story was being told and retold. Not just the ending, but the whole shape of it. The planning that had started before the contract was signed. The secondary plan built into the campaign. The patience of it. The completeness of it. The invoice that arrived before the betrayers had finished celebrating. Mwangi found Voss at the viewport eventually, as he usually did when she had been alone with something too long. He stood beside her and looked out at the same view, the docking bays, the ships, the slow movement of Corvus Reach going about its business all around them. Nairobi station in 9 days, he said, if we take the direct route. 9 days is fine, she said. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Do you think they'll learn from it? He asked. The Empire. Voss thought about this seriously, the way she thought about all tactical questions. Drethak won't be in power much longer. The Council will move on him within the year with the financial data. The next administration will have different priorities. Maybe they'll behave better, she paused. Maybe they won't. And if they don't? She looked at her reflection in the viewport glass, at the small iron clasp on her collar. Then someone else will need to send them an invoice, she said. Mwangi smiled, a slow, broad smile that made him look for a moment like the young man he had been a very long time ago on a station far from here. We should charge more next time, he said. Voss almost smiled, almost. We always charge more next time, she said. She picked up her jacket from the chair beside her, put it on, and walked toward the door. Get some rest, she said. We leave tomorrow. Outside in the corridor, the music was still playing. The ironclad company was still talking and laughing and arguing about things that had nothing to do with war. 3,200 people on a neutral station at the edge of the galaxy, alive and paid and going home, because someone had read the contract very carefully and planned for everything. As Voss walked the corridor, a young soldier, barely 20, one of the newer recruits who had joined the company only 8 months ago, stepped back to let her pass and then said, quietly and simply, "Colonel." She paused, looked at him. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded. It meant several things at once. Thank you, and we made it, and I understand now what this company is, and she understood all of it. She nodded back. Then she walked on, already thinking about the next job, the next contract, the next planet at the edge of someone's war. And somewhere behind her, the music played on.